Hi, folks. My name is Damon Cortese, and I am a principal developer advocate for EMR at AWS. And today I want to talk to you about Amazon EMR Studio. So, EMR Studio went GA a few weeks ago. It's now generally available, and it's a way for you to easily develop, debug, and deploy big data applications on EMR. So, let's get started. If you're not familiar with EMR, it's a way to deploy open source Hadoop frameworks on top of AWS. So things like Spark, Hive, Presto, HBase, these are all frameworks that you can deploy with EMR on top of AWS. And we try to keep up to date with the latest open source frameworks within about 30 days as well. So if you've ever deployed a Spark cluster, if you've ever deployed an HBase cluster, EMR makes it so much easier and both more performant and cheaper cost, of course. So what that looks like, say you want to deploy a Spark cluster, you go into the EMR console, you select Spark, what version you want to use, you select the instance types that you want to use and how many of them, and you hit go. And we take care of provisioning the infrastructure, deploying the software, and then keeping that up and running for you as well. So that's one of the great things about EMR. You can do that with all these different frameworks. Really easy to get deployed there. The other thing is there's better performance too at lower cost. So with the EMR Spark runtime, for example, you can run jobs 2.4 times faster compared to open source. And we also recently released some EMR runtime optimizations for Presto too. So just by running on EMR, you can get performance improvements pretty easily as well. And of course, with faster jobs comes lower cost. If you want to optimize cost even more, you can also use EC2 spot and reserved instances for your infrastructure in order to get better cost there as well. And then one of the big things about EMR and the way that this gets deployed is it allows you to separate your storage and compute. So with EMR, you can read data off of S3 and you can store as much data as you want to in there, and S3 will take care of reliability and redundancy. And then you can spin up clusters that scale on demand. So what that means is you can spin up a Spark cluster with one node, you can spin up 5 clusters with 10 nodes each, you could spin up 10 clusters with 1,000 nodes. It really just depends on how much capacity you need, and you can run those clusters for minutes, you can run them for hours or days. And so it becomes really flexible and allows you to scale your compute independently of your storage. If you've ever run something like HBase before, that's really important too. With HBase, if you ever wanted to increase your HBase capacity, you would need to add more spinning disks and more servers in order to host those spinning disks. Well, with EMR, we have HBase support that can read from S3. So you store your data on S3. You start up your HBase clusters, and you can size them, in terms of your actual workload, and as opposed to how much data you want to store on them. You can even start multiple HBase clusters that read data from the same S3 location, so you can have multiple readers. There's just a lot of flexibility there in terms of scaling your compute independent of your storage. And then speaking of scalability, EMR is really easy to scale as well. So I mentioned you can start clusters of any size depending on your workload. We've also put a lot of work in the past year with EMR managed auto scaling. So you can start a cluster with this enabled. We'll keep an eye on the cluster metrics for you, and we'll scale the cluster out and back in depending on the load on the actual cluster. So you don't even have to worry about figuring out how you want to scale your cluster. If you do want to worry about that, you can totally do that too. You can scale your cluster up in the morning when folks come into work, scale it down when they go home. Well, you know, um, when and if we go back home, and then you can even start, turn them off on the weekends. So a lot of flexibility there, just in terms of scaling those clusters up and down. And EMR supports a large number of different instance types as well. So you can scale your workload vertically if you want. You can just start it with bigger instance types. So that's a quick overview of EMR. The other thing that's been changing a little bit with EMR is just the way that you can deploy it. So in the past, you might be used to EMR on EC2, where you go in there and you pick your instance types, you pick how many you want, and you spin up that cluster. And we, again, provision all the infrastructure and deploy on all the software. And that's been the typical way to deploy EMR up till late. At the end of last year, we also announced EMR on EKS. So if you're using Kubernetes at AWS, you can now run Spark jobs using the EMR runtime on top of EKS. This is pretty cool because the model here is more job centric, whereas with EMR and EC2, it's cluster centric. And what that means is with EC2, you would spin up a cluster, you would usually have multiple folks using that cluster, and you would share some of the resources in that cluster. With EMR and EKS, when you submit a job, that job has a specific association with the user that's running that job, and it'll get resources from the EKS, from the Kubernetes cluster. in order to run that job. So that's a pretty cool deployment option as well. And then finally, EMR has support for AWS Outposts as well. So now you can deploy, manage, and scale EMR in your on-premises environments just as you would in the cloud. And so this is a great option if you have an environment where that you have your data center and you need to run EMR in there, or you're in the process of a on-premises to cloud migration. You can spin up EMR in there initially and start to do that migration before moving fully to the cloud. So there's a lot of deployment options now with EMR as well, which is really great. And then the other thing that's happening is people want simpler environments too. People want better development experience. And so what we've done is we've launched EMR Studio as an integrated development environment for building, deploying, and managing your big data code. So you can essentially build and deploy your code without having to log into the AWS console. This is something that folks have requested quite often as their corporate environments have gotten larger. You can log into EMR Studio with your corporate credentials. They don't need Folks don't need an AWS console login. You can start notebooks, Jupyter notebooks in seconds, and run that jobs later. And you can also build production pipelines with EMR Studio as well. And I'll show you how to do that a little bit later on. And then finally, one of the big benefits here is you can save debugging time with native application UIs inside of EMR Studio. And I'll talk a little bit more about that too in terms of how we've made that easier. So that's EMR Studio. We're trying to make it easier for you to get in there, do your job, and get back out. And without any further ado, what I want to do is I want to hop right into a demo of how to create a studio in EMR. So let me hop out of the presentation. I'll swap over to my browser really quickly. All right. So here I am in the EMR console. If you've used EMR before, this is pretty familiar to you. I've got a list of all my clusters right here. I've got one running. And previously, if you wanted to start EMR, you would go here and click Create Cluster. And this interface is pretty straightforward, right? You name your cluster, you select what release you want, the instance types you want, and then your SSH keys. Now, if you want to switch over to the advanced options, that's where it gets a little bit more complicated. You select all the different types of software you want, and then you click Next, and you get into this section about instance groups and instance fleets and all the different mix and match of instance types. So it can get pretty complex pretty quickly, right? And some folks are used to this and they're pretty good about knowing how to configure this. And in most cases, you're probably only going to go through this process a few times. But like I said, we wanted to make that easier. So let me get out of this interface here and let me go to EMR Studio. You'll notice a new EMR Studio link on your EMR console. And when you click that, that takes you over to the EMR Studio console. Now, what we do on that Getting Started page, I mentioned we do have AWS single sign-on integrated with Studio. So that means that you can import your corporate credentials into SSO. We support Active Directory and other third-party providers as well. So you can import your corporate credentials there. So we just do a quick check in EMR Studio to make sure your SSO is enabled. We also integrate with Service Catalog. So what you can do is you can actually create cluster templates that folks can spin up really easily inside of EMR Studio. And then you just go ahead and create your studio. So if I click on that, this is a one-time setup to go ahead and create your studio. So you might have a data science studio or a big data studio or something like that. You can create a description there. When you first set up the studio, you need to define a few things that get used throughout the creation of the rest of the workspaces in the studio. So there's a service role. This takes care of creating EMR clusters and things like that. And then this is a user role. So these are roles that these are permissions that folks get when they sign into the studio. And you can add additional permissions too to kind of scope that down a little bit. And then you choose an S3 bucket. So when you're creating a studio, this is where all your studio notebooks live. Those all get saved up to S3, so you can open those and close those and have them saved. And then you just select your VPC and subnet. This is if you're spinning up clusters or accessing EMR clusters, the studio just needs to be in the same subnet as your EMR cluster. So you go ahead and do that. And then you click Create Studio. I've already gone ahead and created a studio, so let me go over and show that studio. So when you create that studio, the next thing you need to do is add users to that studio. So if you go into View Details, What you can do, these are all the details of the studio, and then you can add users down here. And this pulls in from AWS SSO again. So I've got my regular daemon and my basic daemon, and I can go ahead and add basic daemon. And then what you can do in there, I get added as an administrator by default, but you can change the policies that are assigned to each user. So I have basic and intermediate policies. There's my EMR Studio basic user policy. And then I also have an intermediate policy. And we'll talk about what the difference is between those in a little bit. So you can assign different users there. So that's creating the studio and granting users access. Now let's hop into the studio to see what that looks like. So I'm going to go ahead and here, and you get a studio access URL. Now, if you're already signed into AWS SSO, you'll be logged directly into the studio. If not, you just sign on with your corporate credentials and you get put back into your studio dashboard here. There's a couple things you can do here. You can create a workspace, or you can also manage your existing clusters. So let's look at our clusters real quickly. So I can see my EMR and EC2 clusters, and this pulls back the different clusters that I have running on EMR and EC2. And you can see this is similar to the EMR console where you get your cluster ID, the name, and different information about the cluster. The other really neat thing is I can click on a cluster here, and depending on the applications that are installed in that cluster, I can launch my different application UIs straight from EMR Studio. So the reason this is awesome is previously, if you were using EMR and EC2, what you would typically have to do is you would create your cluster, and then you would SSH into the cluster to be able to access those cluster UIs, or you'd have to set up the appropriate networking between your corporate environment and the VPC that cluster was running in order to be able to access those cluster UIs. Well, with EMR Studio, now you can just select your cluster here and you can launch the application UI. And I just launched the Spark History server. So this is the Spark History server for that specific cluster that I was just logging into. And now I can see I ran an application on that cluster, so I can click through to that application, and I can see information that is about that application. So I can see what that application was. I can dig into the environment and the executor, so I can kind of debug that application and see what happened. And so that's much easier than SSHing into a cluster and port forwarding. So that's one thing that we've made a little bit easier in EMR Studio, is just the ability to launch those application UIs. And again, that's an off-cluster UI. You don't have to SSH in or anything like that, and you're authenticated through your corporate credentials. If you're using EMR and EKS, you can also manage your EMR and EKS clusters there. So I've got one EMR and EKS cluster running here. I can click through there, and I can also see all the jobs that were running on that cluster. One of the other cool things about EMR and EKS, this is a job that completed, and I can actually go here and I can launch that Spark History server, and that'll pop that open over here. And this is a completed job that's already done, but I can go in and I can debug that job after it's already, oops, let me go back and click that again. So I can launch that up, and I can go in there and I can debug that job after it's already been completed. So that's one of the nice things too about this, is both on EMR and EC2 and EMR and EKS, I can launch those application UIs without having to, kind of connect in and SSH or whatever. And it's really easy. You can see I'm connected to that application UI now. I can go in there and I can debug this Spark job just like I was debugging on EMR and EC2. So pretty easy to go in there and launch those different application UIs directly from EMR Studio. So that's the one big thing about Studio, is it makes it so much easier to kind of look at your clusters and look at your jobs and be able to see some really nice details about those clusters and jobs. But let's go back to the dashboard. And what you probably want to do in EMR Studio is create a workspace. So in order to do that, this will be a fully managed Jupyter notebook, and you can create your workspace here. You can just say Scratch or whatever, and then you select a subnet. Again, this is where the EMR cluster will get created. Now, the other nice thing about EMR Studio is it makes it really easy for you to connect or create clusters. So down here under the advanced configuration, one thing you can do is you can attach to existing clusters. So whether that's EMR and EKS or EMR and EC2, you can go there and just select the cluster that you want to connect to. So that's pretty easy. If you have intermediate or advanced permissions for EMR Studio, you can also use respectively cluster templates or create an EMR cluster from scratch. Cluster templates are really nice. These are CloudFormation templates that are imported into Service Catalog. And so, for example, I've created this matplotlib cluster that has matplotlib, pre-installed and a bunch of other different software pre-installed, and I can go ahead and select that cluster template. And if I want to, I can have a set of parameters that the user can choose for that cluster. So I can change the name or the EMR release, or I can just have no parameters and say, go ahead and start this cluster. So cluster templates are really useful if you've had somebody that's gone ahead and done a lot of the hard work in terms of configuring EMR and creating that cluster template, and then other people can reuse that. So that's really nice. If you're familiar with EMR or you just want to be able to create an EMR cluster from scratch, you can do that too. Again, this is much easier. You just go in here, you enter your cluster name, the EMR release. We take care of provisioning the right applications for you, and you just say how big you want that cluster to be. And when you create the workspace, we'll go ahead and create that cluster for you and attach that notebook to the workspace. So I'm just going to create a workspace and attach it to an existing cluster. And I've already done that, and you can see my Scratch workspace here. So let me go ahead and launch that workspace. Now what this does is this is going to open my Jupyter Lab notebook for me. And so what happens here is this pops me into Jupyter Lab and connects me to my EMR cluster. And that might be a cluster that's already started, or it might be a cluster that, that I just created. And let's see if we're connected. So over here on the sidebar, you can see that I'm already attached to my ds-matplotlib cluster. If I want, I can detach from that cluster and attach to other clusters. So that's pretty nice. That makes it really easy. But when I first land in my studio here, I've got my little Scratch notebook and a launcher. So I can launch different notebooks with Python 3 or Spark, different Spark kernels. I can hop into a console. The other thing that we have in there are notebook examples. So if you're not quite sure where to get started, just click on that notebook examples command, and we've got a bunch of different notebook examples stored in GitHub that will show you how to do different things. So pandas or matplotlib or querying data from S3, depending on what you want to do, we've got a bunch of different examples in there. When you first launch, though, you get this, this default notebook that's already connected to my cluster and already running Python 3. So I can just go in here, hit print OK, and I can do all my data science stuff or data analyst stuff in here. And of course, this is just a standard Jupyter notebook, so I can do my Markdown, I can do my Python code, I can switch to a PySpark kernel if I wanted to. So that is how you can get started really easily with creating a studio, creating a workspace in the studio, and then creating your own workbook in there. So pretty simple to get started there. Now, one of the things that definitely is common is folks want to be able to connect and collaborate with other people that they're working with. And one common way of doing that is simply in GitHub. So I've got a repository out here of demo code. And so this is my demo code repository. And in there, I've got an EMR Studio notebook that I want to be able to pull in. So I'm going to go ahead and just copy that GitHub URL and go back to my EMR Studio. So in Studio, what you can do is you can actually add a new Git repository. If I go in there, I can do Damon's demo code. I can add the repository URL and the branch name, and then I can connect to this repository without credentials, or I can even create a new secret or use an existing secret. In this case, this would be a personal access token from GitHub, so I could connect as my user, but I'm just going to use a public repository without credentials. I'm just going to go ahead and clone this. So when I hit add repository, that goes and adds that new repository. And I can go ahead and link that repository with this workspace. So I've done this before. You can see my old demo code repository there. So I'm going to go ahead and link that one. And what's happening there is in the background, we're doing a git clone. We're pulling that repository into S3, and then you'll have the information in that repository available in here. So if you wanted to pull your repositories into here, you can go ahead and do that. We support GitHub, Bitbucket, GitLab, and if you have a privately hosted Git repository as well, we also support that. So that takes just a second to clone, depending on how big the repository is. And then if I go back to the file browser here, what you'll see is now there's a demo code folder. So I'll hop in there, I'll go on demo code, EMR, and then Studio, and there's my notebook that I want to pull in. So let's go ahead and open that notebook. And this is just opening it straight from the GitHub repository. And so this is a notebook that I've built, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to build a weather map of the weather for a given day in the US. So I'm going to install a bunch of libraries in EMR Studio. You can do a pip install if you want. So you just go ahead, hit pip install. Those requirements are already on this this notebook. So that just went ahead and did that super easily. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to use the registry of open data. So if you haven't checked this out before, this is pretty cool. With AWS, there's a registry of open data, and there's, I think, over 100 different data sets of freely available data for you to use. And one of those is this ERA5 ZAR data. So this is different types of weather data like precipitation or pressure or temperature. And what I'm going to do, I'm going to take a few of those data points and build a map out of those. So this just shows me reading data from S3. There's this ERA5 PDS bucket, and that just shows me opening that bucket. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to build this weather map for a given day. Now, the main thing that I want to call out here, the reason that I'm doing this, is I have this one cell here that has a weather date in it. So I'm going to say, okay, fine, let's draw a weather map for January 13th. 2020. But the thing about this cell is it has a parameters tag. So if I click the wrench icon over here and go down a little bit, oops, let me click on that cell. You can see this cell has a parameters tag. Now, what this means is that I'll be able to override this parameter as part of a data pipeline. And I'll show exactly how that looks a little bit later on, but this is how we can actually take notebooks and run them as part of data pipelines, which sometimes blows my mind, but is something that can be pretty useful. So I'm going to run through this notebook really quickly. I set the weather date. These are just a few helper functions to read in my data from S3. This cell right here, this opens the ZARs and loads those into different variables. This just formats them. And then down here, this is my matplotlib code that is actually, going to draw my weather map. So if I execute this cell, the old weather map disappears, and there's the weather for January 13th, 2020. You can see it was pretty cold. It looks like there was a cold front coming down into Seattle or something like that. And so that's how you can easily pull in notebooks from different GitHub repos. Now, if I wanted to, I could save this and I could actually go back to the Git section here, and you can see the repository that you're on and the branch that you're on. You can even create a new branch if you want to. So maybe I'll create this and say feature Damon's demo. You can create a branch directly in EMR Studio. And I change this notebook. Maybe let's see, maybe I change this notebook a little bit and I say, let's do it for 2021. How about April 1st? What was happening on April 1st? So I'm going to go ahead and run that cell and all below, and that goes through and pulls in all the data again. And in just a second, we should have our weather map for February or April 1st of this year. You can see it's a little bit warmer. And so let's say I want to commit those changes. So I can just go ahead, take that changed file, stage it, and then add my commit message. Commit for the win or for the queue. And go ahead and commit that. And so that commits that changes. That's not pushed up to the GitHub repository yet, but what I could do is there's a push button up there, and I connected to this repository without credentials. So it's actually going to ask me for credentials before I push. I'm not going to push right now, but this is how you can push back up to the repository. So if you're working with folks, you can make these changes, you can push those changes back up, and that's how you can work with GitHub inside of EMR Studio as well. So that's something that makes it pretty easy to collaborate with your peers. And then the other thing that I want to do, I mentioned we can also parameterize these notebooks. So there's a couple things we need if you want to take this notebook and run it as part of a pipeline. So the first thing that I'm going to do, what I need to do is I need to go back out to my EMR Studio, and I need the cluster or the workspace ID and the cluster ID. So I'm going to go ahead and pull out that information. And so in here, here's my workspace ID, and there's my cluster ID. So in order to run this notebook through a pipeline, I need those two bits of information. And I've got a little bit of sample code over here to go ahead and run this. So I need my editor ID and cluster ID, and I've already got that. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to use the AWS EMR start notebook execution command. And I'll provide the editor ID like I mentioned. Here's the cluster ID down here. And then I can provide a parameter to that notebook. So I'm going to take that weather date parameter and I'll replace that with this 2019-0901 parameter. And then you specify the path to that notebook. And so what I'll do is I'll say, there's my demo code EMR Studio weather day notebook. So I'm going to take this and I'll go ahead and execute this in my console here. So I'll go ahead, I'll hit enter there, and that'll submit a job to the EMR API and give me back this notebook execution ID. And then what I can do is I can take this notebook execution ID and describe notebook execution. And what we should see is we should see this job starting up on the EMR cluster. And so this is a way that you could integrate your notebooks with a data pipeline. So for example, you can take this notebook, you can go ahead and submit it, and you could do this with the command line. You could do this using the API if you wanted to. If you had Airflow up and running, you could actually make this part of an Airflow pipeline too, where you could start notebook execution and provide these different parameters and then wait on that execution to finish. And then once it's finished, you could do other things with that pipeline or just mark it as completed. So this is running right now. We can see that that status is running. And when this is completed, what happens is there's an output notebook URI. So the EMR takes this notebook, runs it through the cluster, and then writes out another copy of that notebook out to S3, out to your EMR Studio storage bucket. If I do one describe notebook execution, you can see that that's finishing up. And what I'm going to do, I'll actually do an S3 copy of that notebook. I'll copy that locally. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to upload that back into my Studio. So we just downloaded that. Let me go back to Studio and I'll open this up. I'll go back to my folder, back down to the root here. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to upload that notebook that I just did. And so this ran the notebook through with that updated parameter. So if I go ahead and open up this notebook and scroll down a little bit, what we're going to see down here is there's my original weather date cell, and then here is the parameterized cell. So this is the parameter that I passed in through the API. So EMR inserted that into the notebook, and then it went through and executed the whole notebook. And if we look down at the bottom, now we have our weather for September 1st, 2019. You can see there was actually a big hurricane. I think that was Hurricane Dorian off of the coast of Florida on that day. And so this is how you can run these parameterized notebooks too as part of a pipeline. And this one, it just dumped it out to the notebook itself, which may or may not be useful. Maybe you are creating notebooks for other folks to consume, but you could also use this to write out to an S3 bucket, or you could call out to an API with different data, right back to a database. So there's a lot of different things that you could actually do with this notebook. So that's a pretty nice example of taking that code, running it through, parameterizing it, and then building it into your pipeline. And so I've got my Git repo here. I could add that back into the Git repo if I wanted to, but I don't necessarily need to do that right now. But again, I think it's so easy to get started here in EMR Studio. If I go back to the launcher, like even just taking one of these sample notebooks, I can pop open this sample notebook right here, and you get a read-only copy by default, but then you can save it to your workspace, and this just creates a copy in your own workspace that you could then commit. And let's see, if I go back in here, and I can just actually go ahead and run this whole notebook for me. So I'm just going to say run, let's say run all cells. And so this goes through and starts just running through all the different cells on this notebook. And you can see it's popping open, another matplotlib chart here, and it's using pandas to kind of pull things down. So there's a set of libraries that are installed by default on EMR Studio, but if you want to, you can install your own, pip libraries. You can just do a pip install, whatever. You can install your own different information. And so pretty easy to get started there. Save this back to your workspace, commit it up to GitHub. So it makes it pretty easy to get started in there. The other thing I do want to call out, we have some demo examples. So I've got my demo code repository here on GitHub that I showed. We do also have in the AWS samples repository, we have an EMR Studio samples repository in there. And so in there, there's a couple different CloudFormation templates. So this can help provision in EMR Studio for you. It gives you the IAM roles that you need and some of the security groups that you need to get started with EMR Studio. And then there's also some cluster templates in here. So these are sample cluster templates you can import into Service Catalog in order to see how to get those clusters up and running. Again, these templates are pretty small. This is a 50-line Service Catalog or CloudFormation template, but it makes it really easy if you're back here in EMR Studio. Again, in the cluster section, not only can you attach to an existing cluster but you can also create clusters from within the workspace as well. So you've got a really simple interface there for creating a cluster. Or if you go to the cluster template, again, you can create a cluster template from within the workspace too. So you can spin that up, use the cluster template with a certain set of parameters, and then detach in here and connect to it. The other workflow that does come up pretty often is people may have development clusters that they work on, and then they may want to run their job on a production cluster that's either larger or has different sets of data on it. So you can easily detach and reattach to other clusters there too. So pretty cool to get up and running. A couple other things I just want to call out. So there's the EMR Studios samples. If we go back to the Jupyter Lab and back over here, in the launcher, I mentioned the notebook examples. Those notebook examples are also on GitHub. So these are just the same examples that you'll see in EMR Studio. We hope to add more examples here as we hear from folks. So definitely, as you work with EMR Studio, if you feel that there are examples that would be useful, definitely feel free to reach out and let us know. And then once you're done with that repo, you can disconnect that. Once you're done with the cluster, you can shut it down. And then that is, how you can get started with EMR Studio. So again, you hop in there, you've got this dashboard, you can easily create a workspace with your clusters. You can easily manage your EMR on EC2 clusters and all the different application UIs on there as well. You can easily connect to GitHub and push changes up to GitHub or pull changes down and collaborate with folks from that way. And that is how to get started with EMR Studio. So something we're really excited about. The goal here is to make it easier for folks to be able to get into their work, do that analysis, make it easier to run EMR clusters, make it easier to run EMR on EKS, and also debug those jobs a lot easier too. So that's kind of it for today. We're going to take some Q&A for a little bit. So if you have any questions, definitely let us know. The other thing I do want to mention, feel free to reach out to me at any time. I'm at Decourt on Twitter, and decourt.dev is my website. So go check that out. I've got a YouTube channel where I'm putting out more videos about EMR Studio and just EMR in general and analytics in general. So feel free to subscribe to that. And I just want to thank you all for tuning in today. And let's see if we got any questions. All right. Thanks, everybody.